I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch network, and this is a breaking news alert. We are now learning, with CNN first reporting this, that Mark Meadows, the former White House chief of staff, has been subpoenaed by special counsel Jack Smith for testimony and documents before the criminal grand jury in Washington, D.C. This is big, folks, after special counsel Jack Smith has also subpoenaed former Vice President Pence, the former head of the NSA, Robert O'Brien, after we've learned that special counsel Jack Smith is also invoking the crime fraud exception to try to challenge assertions of attorney-client privilege by Trump's many lawyers like Evan Corcoran and Christina Bobb and Alina Habba, who have appeared before the criminal grand jury in Washington, D.C., after we've learned about numerous other appearances by witnesses before the grand jury. The pace and intensification of special counsel Jack Smith's proceedings, his investigation, is undeniable, especially now with this breaking news that Mark Meadows has been subpoenaed. Now, we've been asking here on the MeidasTouch network, is Mark Meadows cooperating with the Department of Justice and special counsel Jack Smith? The fact that Mark Meadows has now been subpoenaed doesn't quite answer that question, because on the one hand, you would assume, well, if he's being subpoenaed, then he's not cooperating. He's not participating, because the subpoena process would compel the testimony, would compel the production of documents. On the other hand, it is often a procedure and tactic used by the Department of Justice to give cover to people who are cooperating, to subpoena them, so people on the outside who are also being investigated don't know whether the cooperation is taking place or not. So it could be that there is cooperation and this is just being used as cover. Now, Mark Meadows undoubtedly has critical evidence and critical information, and himself would likely be a criminal co-conspirator in all of Donald Trump's criminal conduct and criminal machinations in all of the cases. Recall, there are two criminal grand juries currently impaneled right now in Washington, D.C., at least two. One of them is investigating Donald Trump's election interference, and this includes everything from what took place on January 6th to the phony or fraudulent elector scheme, to the intimidation and harassment of state and local election officials, to all of Donald Trump's scam political organizations and the campaign violations taking place there. Mark Meadows was in the heart of all of that. Because Donald Trump doesn't use emails or he doesn't use text messages, all of the messages, all of the coordination with Trump took place directly through Meadows. So Meadows is the repository of all of those messages, of all of that information. So it would clearly be a criminal co-conspirator there. And then with respect to Donald Trump's theft of thousands of government records, including sensitive compartmented information, the highest classified records, well, there again, clearly Mark Meadows would be in the center of that, as well as Mark Meadows, being the former chief of staff, would be among the people who would be responsible for setting in place the correct protocols to make sure the Presidential Records Act was followed, but most significantly, that government records were not being stolen and misappropriated, that obstruction of justice was not taking place, that there wasn't concealment and mutilation of top secret records and government records in general, and that there was not violations of the Espionage Act. So with respect to all the criminal cases, Mark Meadows is at the heart of it. Now, which you may recall as well, that back in October of 2021, with respect to the January 6th committee, Mark Meadows at first appeared that he may be cooperating, right? Meadows turned over like 2,319 text messages to the January 6th committee in response to their subpoena. However, as the date got closer to when his testimony was actually supposed to take place in late 2021, right before it, Meadows said, you know what, I am not going to testify before the January 6th committee. Around the same time, you may also recall that one of Donald Trump's grifty political organizations transferred about $1 million to an organization that Meadows would be working at when Meadows was no longer working for Trump. So that happened. And then Meadows said, I'm not showing up even though I've turned over all of these text messages. And Meadows filed a lawsuit against the January 6th committee and Nancy Pelosi that he ultimately lost, but was able to run out the clock. The January 6th committee then made a referral, a criminal referral, for Meadows to be prosecuted by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice never took on that criminal referral. They never prosecuted Mark Meadows for contempt of Congress. And one of the suppositions why they may not have done that was the Department of Justice has bigger fish to fry when it comes to Mark Meadows, whereas a contempt of Congress charge is a misdemeanor. The Department of Justice has probably numerous felony statutes that it could be holding and is holding over Mark Meadows' head for his role and involvement in 2020 election interference on the January 6th insurrection itself, as well as the theft of all of these records. And so even though Meadows lost the lawsuit that he filed against the January 6th committee, he ultimately ran out the clock there and never testified there. Nonetheless, he was subpoenaed, you will recall, by Fulton County prosecutor Fani Willis, and did have to participate in that proceeding when he lost the lawsuits that he filed in South Carolina, where he now resides. And so he ultimately had to participate in that matter. But what's really big here, though, is special counsel Jack Smith's subpoena. And that's the breaking news right now. So here's the thing. Mark Meadows selectively cherry-picked the 2,319 text messages that ultimately were turned over to the January 6th committee. And those are some really damaging ones. Those are from all of the MAGA Republican members of the House and the Senate and all of the interest groups and all of the people basically participating, encouraging the insurrection and all the unlawful conduct, right? I mean, Meadows was at the heart of it. Meadows was the hub of all of that conduct. And so additional text messages exist. We know that because Meadows was turning over on a rolling basis to the January 6th committee text messages. He did not turn over all the text messages. In fact, there's a lot more text messages that exist that special counsel Jack Smith is undoubtedly going to look for, has undoubtedly subpoenaed, and that Mark Meadows does not want to turn over at all. Now, what happens if Mark Meadows deleted it or destroyed it? In that case, Mark Meadows can be tried for obstruction of justice if he did that, which would carry a penalty of up to 20 years in prison. So that could be a big issue if Mark Meadows actually destroyed the evidence that we all know exists. So that's one thing. Now, one of the things that Mark Meadows may do in response to this subpoena, but he will lose if he tries to do this, is assert executive privilege. And he's going to lose for two reasons. But the overarching way I have a great degree of confidence that he is ultimately going to lose is because the Department of Justice and Jack Smith have litigated these executive privilege claims before the judge who oversees the criminal grand jury who's ruled on matters like that. That's Judge Beryl Howell. You may recall Donald Trump has previously asserted executive privilege over his top White House lawyers, the former top White House lawyers, Pat Cipollone and Patrick Philbin. And Donald Trump has also asserted executive privilege over Pence's former top deputies, Pence's former chief of staff, Mark Short, and Pence's former general counsel, Greg Jacob. In all of those instances, the executive privilege was claimed while they testified. Then the Department of Justice filed a motion, and they prevailed in the motion, so all of those individuals had to testify again. They came back for a second day of testimony. Now, there are two reasons really why the executive privilege doesn't hold. One, the idea that a former executive can assert executive privilege is without merit or certainly lacks any significant precedent. The executive privilege is only held by the current executive branch, which would be Biden, who's not claiming executive privilege. The DOJ is the current executive branch. But even if you can make this executive privilege claim as a former administration, an executive privilege is not an absolute privilege. It gives way where there is a compelling interest, for example, in an ongoing criminal investigation into an attempt to overthrow our democracy. So for those reasons, if Meadows tries to assert executive privilege, he's not going to prevail. And these proceedings before Judge Beryl Howell, before the federal judge, they move quicker. Do not expect a lot of delay there. There's a certain amount of time that Meadows will have to respond, but Meadows does not have great legal grounds. In fact, he has almost no legal grounds here to be asserting executive privilege. He may, well, it's Trump who will assert it, may assert it anyway, but I'm very, very confident the Department of Justice will prevail there. So those are all the factors, folks, with the new subpoena of Mark Meadows. Is he a cooperator? Is he not a cooperator? We still don't know. We'll know soon, though, if there is a cooperation and what actually transpires before the grand jury. Granted, those proceedings before the grand jury are often done in private, but I'm sure with the sources that are out there, we will learn more about that soon. But he's got a treasure trove of documents. He only partially cooperated, and I'm using partially. He's doing a lot of work there with the January 6th committee, but those 2,319 text messages had a lot of information in them, a lot of damaging information. Undoubtedly, the Department of Justice is probably letting Mark Meadows know, we're going to prosecute you. You are someone who engaged in criminal conduct, so you don't want to cooperate. Let's see what happens there. But of course, we will keep you updated here on the MeidasTouch Network. Now, do me this favor, please. Hit the subscribe button right now. Hit subscribe to this YouTube channel, please. We're on our way to 1 million subscribers thanks to your incredible support. While you're at it, check out the MeidasTouch podcast wherever you get your audio podcast. Subscribe right now. Just go search for podcasts, search MeidasTouch, hit subscribe. Let me know that you subscribed. We want to keep growing that podcast audience. Check out Killing County on Hulu, which I co-executive produced with Colin Kaepernick and others about the crime, corruption, and cover-up in Bakersfield. And while you're at it, check us out at patreon.com/MeidasTouch, patreon.com/MeidasTouch. We've got a lot of exclusive content you can only get at our Patreon, but most importantly, it helps grow this independent media platform. So thank you all so much for watching this. Hit subscribe. This is big breaking news, and I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network.
At MeidasTouch, we are unapologetically pro-democracy, and we demand justice and accountability. That's why we're spreading our message to Convict 45. That's right, gear up right now with your Convict 45 tees and pins at store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.